The year was 1865. The war had ended, but the scars ran deep. Towns smoldered in the east, their streets littered with shattered glass and broken dreams. Men returned home, their hands still shaking from the weight of rifles, only to find their fields overgrown and their families thinner than they remembered. Hope was a currency most could no longer afford. But out west, the land remained wild, untamed, and indifferent to the suffering of men. It was a place of risk, of ruin, but also of reinvention. And for some, that promise was worth everything. Rebecca tightened her grip on the reins, her knuckles paling as the wind tugged at her shawl. The wagon creaked beneath her, a slow, rhythmic groan that had become the soundtrack of their journey. Matthew sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the endless stretch of road ahead, where the sun melted into the horizon like spilled ink. His hands, once soft with the privilege of an educated life, were now callous from months of guiding the wagon over rock and dust. "We're close," he murmured, though there was no real measured distance in a land that stretched beyond sight. Rebecca didn't answer. She had learned not to trust his optimism. He had promised her they would be safe by now, that they would reach their new home before the first snow, that the war had taken enough from them. But promises were fragile things, and she had seen too many break. The Oregon Trail had not been kind. The days were grueling, the nights colder than she expected. Some mornings, she woke to frost coating the inside of the wagon, Matthew's arm wrapped tightly around her as if trying to shield her from the very air itself. They had left everything behind for this. Family, security, the ghosts of the past. But the land did not care. It swallowed people whole and did not weep for them. Ahead, the trail narrowed, forcing them between towering rock formations that cast long, skeletal shadows across the road. Rebecca shivered. Something about the silence unsettled her. A distant flicker of movement caught her eye. On the ridge above, dark figures on horseback stood against the fading light, watching. Matthew saw them too. His grip on the reins tightened, his posture stiffening. "Keep your eyes forward," he said, his voice even but low. "Don't stop." Rebecca obeyed, though the weight of unseen eyes pressed against her back. They rode in silence, the tension between them thick enough to smother the air. The figures did not follow. They did not call out. They only watched. When they finally crested the next hill, the sight of the trading post in the valley below brought a breath of relief Rebecca hadn't realized she was holding. It was small, little more than a collection of wooden buildings clustered together, like animals bracing against the wind. A handful of other wagons were scattered outside, their owners tending to their weary horses. Smoke curled from a chimney. The scent of burning would carry it on the wind. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a place to resupply. They needed that. As they rolled into the settlement, Rebecca took in the faces of those around her. Weathered men with sun-scorched skin leaned against their wagons, their expressions unreadable. Women moved in and out of buildings, their eyes wary, their children clinging close to their skirts. Near the far edge of the post, a group of Cheyenne sat gathered around a low fire. They were quiet, their movements slow and deliberate. Rebecca had never been this close to them before. She had heard stories, whispers of raids, of blood spilled on lonely trails, of settlers disappearing into the night. But as she watched them, she saw no malice in their faces, only patience. Matthew stepped down from the wagon and offered his hand to her. She hesitated before taking it, her boots hitting the dry earth. Inside the trading post, the warmth of the fire did little to chase away the tension in the air. The wooden walls were lined with barrels and sacks of grain, shelves stocked with supplies priced too high for most to afford. The scent of tobacco and sweat thickened the air, and every conversation seemed to stop the moment they entered. Men leaned against the bar, their voices low, their glances sharp. The barkeep, a heavy-set man with a grizzled beard, barely looked up as Matthew approached. "We need supplies," Matthew said, pulling a few coins from his coat. "Flour, salt, maybe some dried meat." The barkeep took the money without a word and disappeared into the back. Rebecca shifted uneasily, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. She could feel the stares on her, men measuring, calculating. From the corner of the room, a voice rose, slurred and thick with whiskey. "Shouldn't be here." The room went still. A man at the bar turned, his eyes bloodshot, his mouth curling into something that might have once been a smile. Indians, he spat, watching from their camp like damn vultures. Ain't right. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. Another man, younger but just as warm by the land, exhaled sharply. They ain't done nothing. Yet, the first man countered, pushing himself up from his stool. His gaze flickered toward the window, where the distant figures of the Cheyenne were still visible. This is settler land. Ain't no place for them here. Matthew took a step forward. We don't want trouble. The man's attention snapped to him, and his grin widened. Then you best keep your mouth shut. A hand brushed against Rebecca's arm. So quick she almost missed it. She turned, locking eyes with an older woman near the doorway. The woman's face was lined with years of hardship, but her grip was firm. A warning. Come, the woman whispered, barely audible over the tension in the room. Take your things and go. But it was already too late. The scrape of a chair against the wooden floor. The metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Get out of here. A voice barked. A man near the door had drawn his weapon, aiming at something just beyond the threshold. Rebecca turned just in time to see a Cheyenne man standing there, his hands raised, his face unreadable. Time stretched in. A single breath of silence before the storm. Then, the first shot rang out. The room exploded into chaos. Gunfire. Shouts. The acrid stench of smoke and sweat. Rebecca ducked as the first bullet shattered a whiskey bottle near her head, glass raining onto the floor. Matthew reached for her, his face contorted with fear, but before he could close the distance, the second shot struck him. He staggered, his breath escaping in a sharp gasp. Rebecca screamed. Matthew fell. The world blurred around her. The walls, the gunfire, the men shouting. All of it faded into a dull roar. She dropped to her knees, hands grasping at him, at the warmth rapidly leaving his body. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment there was nothing but silence between them. Then his breath hitched, and he was gone. A hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her away as bullets ripped through the walls. The trading post had become a war zone. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of hoofbeats thundered against the earth. Rebecca couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Matthew was dead. The war had taken him after all. The world had turned to silence. The crack of gunfire, the splintering of wood, the shouts of men, faded into a distant hum, swallowed by the wind. Rebecca knelt beside Matthew's body, unable to move, unable to think. Blood soaked through the fabric of his coat. Pooling beneath him, dark and final. She traced her fingers over his cheek, his skin already losing its warmth. His eyes, once so bright with dreams, were empty now, fixed on something beyond her reach. A rough hand yanked her backward. She gasped, her vision snapping back into focus. Smoke curled through the air, the scent of burning wood, and gunpowder choking her lungs. Around her, men fought, some scrambling for the doors, others firing wildly into the growing chaos. A Cheyenne man stood near the entrance, his hands still raised, his face unreadable. Someone struck him hard across the face with the butt of a rifle. He staggered, blood trailing from his mouth. Rebecca's breath came in sharp gasps. She had to move. She had to leave. A body slammed against her, knocking her sideways. The weight of the moment shattered. Her limbs, frozen by grief, jolted into action. She scrambled backward, slipping on the blood-slicked floor, her skirts tangling around her legs. The door. She had to get to the door. She didn't look back. Couldn't. The walls of the trading post blurred as she pushed forward, weaving through the chaos, her pulse pounding against her ribs. A man lunged for her. His face was familiar, one of the men from bar, his mouth twisted in a snarl. She ducked, felt the rush of air as his fingers grasped for her shawl. And then she was outside. The cold night air hit her like a slap. The ground beneath her was hard, frozen in patches where the frost had settled early. The sky stretched wide, the stars distant and indifferent. Run. She had no direction, no plan, only the instinct to flee. Her boots pounded against the dirt as she darted between wagons, past terrified settlers scrambling for cover. Somewhere, a woman screamed. Hoofbeats thundered in the distance, the sound reverberating through the valley. She didn't stop. The trees loomed ahead, their skeletal branches reaching for the sky. The moment she crossed into the forest, the sounds of the trading post faded behind her, swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed against the trunk of a tree, her chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. The night pressing around her, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, her fingers trembling as she wiped at her face. Matthew was gone. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. They had been heading west together, their dreams woven into the fabric of the journey. He had promised her safety, a future, and now he was just another body left behind in the dust. A sob caught her throat, but she swallowed it down. There was no time for grief. Not here. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Her body tensed, her breath hitching. She pressed herself against the tree, listening. The wind whistled through the branches, but beneath it, something else. Movement. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she reached for the small knife hidden in her skirts. It wasn't much, barely sharp enough to cut through rope, but it was all she had. Another rustle. Closer this time. Her fingers tightened around the handle. And then she saw him, a figure slumped against a tree a few yards away, half hidden in the shadows. Moonlight filtered through the branches, casting a faint glow over him. Blood stained the ground beneath him. For a moment, all she could do was stare. The man was Cheyenne. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. His hand pressed weakly to his side, where dark crimson seeped through his clothing. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to run deeper into the forest, to put as much distance between herself and him as possible. But she didn't move. She had seen him before, at the trading post. He had been standing in the doorway when the shot was fired, his hands raised, unarmed. He hadn't attacked anyone. He hadn't fought back. And now he was dying. Her grip on the knife loosened. Carefully, she took a step forward. Then another. His eyes flooded open, dark and unfocused. For a moment, they just looked at each other. He said something, his voice low, the words foreign to her ears. She didn't understand, but the tone, it wasn't threatening. It was pleading. Rebecca hesitated only a moment longer before kneeling beside him. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, his jaw tight with pain. Blood pooled around his waist where the bullet had torn through him. She had no medicine, no proper bandages, only the clothes on her back. Swallowing hard, she tore a strip from her petticoat, the fabric fraying beneath her fingers. He tensed as she pressed it against the wound, his body going rigid. "You're losing too much blood," she murmured, as if he could understand. His gaze flickered over her face, his breathing unsteady. She wrapped the makeshift bandage around him as tightly as she could. His skin was feverish beneath her touch, sweat dampening his brow. He was in bad shape. If infection set in, a sound in the distance made her freeze. Hoofbeats. Panic surged through her veins. Someone was coming. She turned back to him. His strength was fading, his head tilting slightly as he fought to stay conscious. She had a choice. Leave him, save herself, or take him with her. The wind shifted, carrying the distant echoes of voices. Rebecca clenched her jaw. She hadn't saved him just to let him die now. Bracing herself, she hooked her arms under his, gritting her teeth as she pulled him upright. He let out a low, pained groan but didn't fight her. "We have to move," she whispered. She wasn't sure if he understood, but he didn't resist as she half-dragged, half-carried him deeper into the trees. The hoofbeats grew louder. The wilderness swallowed them whole. The night stretched on, cold and merciless, as Rebecca pressed forward through the thick underbrush, the weight of the wounded man pulling at her shoulders. His breaths came ragged, uneven, each step a battle against the pain searing through his body. His blood had already soaked through the makeshift bandage she had tied around his waist, staining her hands, but there was no time to stop. Behind them, the distant sound of hoofbeats still echoed through the trees, a grim reminder that danger was never far. She didn't know where she was going. only that she had to keep moving. The forest was dense, the path ahead swallowed in darkness, but she forced her feet forward, her mind numb with exhaustion. The man, his strength nearly spent, slumped against her, his weight dragging heavier with each step. He murmured something in his language. The words lost a wind, but the tone was unmistakable. He was slipping. A clearing appeared ahead, a break in the endless trees. There, nestled against the roots of an ancient oak, was a small overhang of rock. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. With the last of her strength, she eased him down onto the cold earth, his body shuddering from the effort. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, but he was alive. Rebecca collapsed beside him, her chest rising and falling in sharp, desperate gulps of air. Her limbs trembled from exhaustion, but she couldn't rest yet. Reaching into the satchel slung across her shoulder, she pulled out the last of their water and held it to his lips. He didn't move at first, his eyes half-lidded, but after a moment he swallowed, his throat working weakly. She exhaled in relief. At least he was still fighting. The night was cruel, the wind biting through her thin shawl as she huddled beside him. Every few moments his body jerked, his muscles tensing from the pain in his side. She pressed a hand against his forehead. Too warm. Fever was setting in. Her heart pounded as she looked around, searching for anything that could help. The forest was vast, but it offered little in the way of comfort. Somewhere in the distance an owl called, its voice a lonely echo through the trees. She needed fire, warmth. Tearing the hem of her skirt, she bundled the fabric into a rough pile and struck flint against stone. Sparks flared, catching the dry leaves, and slowly the flames came to life. The light cast long shadows against the trees, flickering against the contours of the man's face. He was younger than she had realized, though his eyes, when they briefly opened, held years of knowledge and hardship. She watched him for a long moment, her thoughts tangled between exhaustion and grief. He was supposed to be the enemy. That was what she had been told. But the enemy didn't bleed the same way, didn't suffer the same. The enemy didn't look at her the way he did, calm, unreadable, yet entirely aware. As the fire crackled, she murmured, "Who are you?" His gaze flickered to hers. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he rasped a single word, "Hawkeye." His voice was low, rough with pain. She let the name settle between them before nodding. It suited him, sharp, watchful. She hesitated before pressing a hand lightly against his bandaged side. His body tensed, but he didn't flinch away. "You need better medicine than I have," she said, not sure if he could understand her. "I don't know how to help you." Hawkeye closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing his options, then lifted a weak hand, pointing past the trees. There was something there, something he wasn't strong enough to reach on his own. She exhaled, rubbing her hands over her chilled arms. The thought of wandering deeper into the unknown alone sent a prickle of unease through her spine. But what choice did she have? If she left him like this, he wouldn't survive the night. "I'll go," she said, pushing to her feet. "But you better not be dead when I get back." Hawkeye said nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched, just slightly. She turned, slipping into the forest, the firelight fading behind her. The woods were different in the dark, deeper, hungrier. Each rustling branch felt like watching eyes, every gust of wind a whisper of something unseen. But she moved with purpose, scanning the ground for any sign of what he had meant. Minutes stretched into an eternity before she found it. Nestled beneath a fallen tree was a small bundle of wrapped herbs, tucked carefully away from sight. Someone had placed it here, hidden it. She didn't know if it was meant for him or another, but it didn't matter. She took it and turned back. When she reached the fire, Hawkeye's eyes were barely open, his breathing more labored. The fever had worsened in her absence. Kneeling beside him, she unwrapped the herbs and hesitated. She had no idea what they were, but something in her gut told her to trust him. Carefully, she pressed the leaves into a small bowl of water and crushed them into a thick paste. She looked at him once more. This might hurt. His lips barely moved, but she thought she saw the trace of a smirk. She pressed the mixture against his wound. He jerked, his teeth gritted, but he didn't cry out. Minutes passed. His breathing steadied. The fire crackled between them. She sat back, exhaustion pulling at her bones. But for the first time since the trading post, she didn't feel entirely alone. The days stretched into a rhythm. She hunted what little she could, setting traps for rabbits, gathering what edible plants she could find. Hawkeye grew stronger, though he spoke little. At first, their words were few. His English was broken, her Cheyenne non-existent. But language wasn't always needed. She learned his expressions, the way his eyes flickered with amusement when she stumbled to the woods, the way his jaw tightened when his wound pained him. He was patient, watching her with something that felt more like quiet curiosity than suspicion. One afternoon, as they walked along the river, she lost her footing on the slick rocks. The cold water dragged her under, ice slipping into her veins. Panic seized her. She couldn't find the surface. Then, strong hands grasped her wrist. She was pulled up, gasping, water streaming from her hair. She clung to the riverbank, coughing, shivering. Hawkeye knelt beside her. He didn't speak. He simply tapped his chest. "Strong," he said. She looked at him, breathless, and then, for the first time in weeks, she laughed. It was small, barely more than a breath, but real. Hawkeye's lips twitched. They weren't friends. Not yet, but they were something. That night, as the fire burned low, she caught him watching her. His gaze was unreadable, but it held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition, not of what they were, but of what they could become. The wind shifted, carried with it the scent of smoke and something else. Something sharper, more dangerous. Rebecca paused, fingers tightening around the small knife at her belt, her breath forming thin clouds in the cold air. Hawkeye had stopped beside her, his body tense, listening. He had heard it too, a sound just beneath the rustling of the trees. Footsteps. Her pulse quickened. They had been careful, moving through the wilderness with purpose but never haste, avoiding open spaces, making camp in places where the land itself concealed them. But someone had found them, or had been following them all along. Hawkeye raised a hand, the signal for silence. A twig snapped. Rebecca barely had time to react before a voice, gruff and laced with amusement, cut through the stillness. Well, the man drawled. "Look what we have here." The first figure stepped into the moonlight, a rifle resting casually over his shoulder. His face was rough, sun-scorched, with a jagged scar running down his cheek. Two others followed behind him, their eyes hungry, movements slow and deliberate, like wolves circling their prey. Bandits. Rebecca's stomach clenched. These weren't just desperate men looking for food. These were scavengers, predators who thrived on the weak and the lost. And they had just cornered their next meal. Hawkeye didn't move. His expression was unreadable. But Rebecca saw the way his fingers drifted toward the bow slung across his back, the way his body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. The leader smiled, his teeth yellow in the dim light. "Didn't think we'd catch up to you so soon," he said. His gaze flicked to Rebecca, slow and calculating. "We saw you back at the trading post, girl. Thought you'd be long dead by now." She swallowed the fear clawing its way up her throat. "We have nothing worth taking," she said, forcing her voice to stay even. The leader chuckled. "See, that's where you're wrong." Rebecca's grip on her knife tightened. One of the men shifted forward, reaching for her. Hawkeye moved first. It happened in the space of a breath. His hand flashed his bow, an arrow loose before the bandit even realized what was happening. The man jerked back with a strangled cry, clutching his shoulder where the arrow had buried itself deep. Then the world exploded into motion. Rebecca ducked as the leader swung his rifle toward Hawkeye, the crack of gunfire splitting the night. She lunged forward, the knife in her hand finding flesh, dragging across the man's arm. He roared in pain, backhanding her so hard she stumbled, her vision flashing white. Hawkeye was already moving, a second arrow drawn, and loose before the leader could recover. It struck him in the leg, sending him sprawling onto the ground with a snarl. The remaining bandit hesitated, his gun wavering. He looked at the scene before him, at his wounded companions, and Rebecca saw it. The flicker of doubt, the recognition that this wasn't the easy fight he had expected. "Go!" she breathed, voice shaking with adrenaline. The man hesitated a moment longer. Then he turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Silence settled over the clearing. The leader, still on the ground, let out a low, wheezing laugh. "You should have let me kill you quick, girl," he muttered, his voice thick with venom. "Ain't no life waiting for you out here. Just more death." Rebecca stepped closer, her breath unsteady. She could still feel the sting where he had hit her, still taste the copper tang of blood in her mouth. She looked down at him, at the man who had thought he could decide her fate. "I survived worse," she said, and she turned away. Hawkeye watched her, his expression unreadable, then stepped past her. He knelt by the bandit, gripping the man's collar in one strong hand. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice low and calm, he murmured something in his own language. Whatever it was, the bandit's sneer faltered. Hawkeye released him with a shove, and the man scrambled away, limping into the darkness. Rebecca exhaled, her body trembling from the aftermath. She turned toward Hawkeye, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." He studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. The journey didn't end that night. They traveled for days, pushing forward through bitter cold and harsh winds, their bond now forged in blood and survival. But the closer they got to civilization, the heavier Rebecca's heart became. She had always known this wasn't forever. The town appeared in the distance one morning, a collection of wooden buildings standing defiantly against the wilderness. Smoke curled from chimneys, the distant sound of hammers against wood ringing through the crisp air. A new beginning. She turned to Hawkeye. He stood still, watching her, his expression calm but knowing. This was where they parted ways. "I don't want to leave," she admitted, her throat tightening. For the first time, his lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. He stepped forward, placing his hand over her heart, then his own, a silent promise. She understood. She had thought strength meant surviving alone, but she had learned something greater. Strength was trust. Strength was knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Strength was allowing someone in, even when the world told you not to. The town waited. A new life, a chance to rebuild. She took a deep breath and walked forward,